The Hanafi Siege was a terrorist attack, hostage-taking and standoff in Washington D.C. that occurred during the duration of 3 days, from March the 9th to March the 11th in 1977. A total of 3 buildings were seized: the John A. Wilson District Building, the B'nai B'rith Jewish Headquarters and the Islamic Centre of Washington were all seized by 12 men armed with rifles, shotguns, machetes and swords, who took 149 hostages and who threatened to start beheading the hostages if their demands were not met. During the attack and takeover of the buildings, 2 people were killed: a journalist who was shot to death and a police officer, and 3 others were seriously injured but survived. After a 39-hour standoff, involving also several ambassadors from various Islamic countries such as Egypt's Ashraf Ghorbal, Pakistan's Shahzada Yaqub Khan and Iran's Ardashir Sahidi, who read the Quran to appeal to their conscience, the gunmen surrendered and all remaining hostages were released. And the gunmen were taken into custody, though they were temporarily freed for a short while due to judicial issues. But later backtracking made it so that all the 12 gunmen involved in this Hanafi Siege were later tried and convicted, with Hamaas Abdul Khaalis, the leader, receiving a sentence of life which he would serve until he died in prison, and Abdul Musikir, who shot and killed Maurice Williams, the journalist, was sentenced to 70 years in prison and released in 2022 on parole. The leader, Hamaas Abdul Khaalis, who planned and organized this entire attack, had been previously discharged from the US Army on grounds of mental instability, and later had worked as a jazz drummer in New York City before joining the Nation of Islam. Joining the Nation of Islam, he changed his name from Ernest Timothy McGee to Hamaas Abdul Khaalis. Within the organization of the Nation of Islam, Hamaas Abdul Khaalis quickly rose to the ranks and became a national secretary of the Nation of Islam. Though this would not last, as Khaalis split with the Nation of Islam in 1958 to found a rival Islamic organization, the Hanafi Movement, after having been inspired by radical Hanafi Sufi preachers coming from Southeastern Asia, among them a Bengali sheikh named Tasibur Uddin Rahman, was preaching about a coming new age, an age of an Islamic utopia, had inspired him. And in 1972, Hamaas Abdul Khaalis published an open letter attacking the leadership and beliefs of the Nation of Islam, condemning them. A year later, a group of men broke into Khaalis' Washington D.C. home and murdered his children and wife. The men that were prosecuted for these acts were all associated with the Nation of Islam. And further problems arose with the trial, and the high-profile murder trial was delayed for several years. Khaalis' daughter, the only survivor of the massacre, had suffered mental breakdowns due to post-traumatic stress disorder and allegedly sustained brain damage during the attack on Khaalis' home. Khaalis and his family had urged prosecutors to allow her to submit a sworn statement. Despite this, the prosecutors persuaded her to stand before the court. When the trial began in fall of 1976, she became incoherent under cross-examination due to stress and when forced to talk about the murders, and fled the courtroom in panic. The judge wrote a warrant for her arrest, then eventually declared a mistrial for certain members of the group of prosecuted suspects, though 5 of the killers of his family were eventually convicted and given life sentences. This, however, did not satisfy Khaalis, as some of the people involved on likely suspicions of being involved in this act of murder were not convicted, causing Khaalis to feel great anger and resentment. And in the meantime, during this entire court process, Khaalis continued to become even more radicalized in his utopian Hanafi Sufi beliefs, and he gathered various radicals around him, planning to commit this deed that would occur on March the 9th of 1977, motivating this act to his followers with the rationale of it being in order to protect the glory of Islam and the future strength of the faith, and to bring forth a greater and better society based upon Islamic principles as they interpreted it. And some of the demands that they put forward during the hostage taking do align with this view, this worldview of this radical group of Hanafi Sufi Muslims. For example, during the attack and hostage taking, one of the demands was that the recently released film The Message, or as it is also called, Muhammad, Messenger of God, was to be banned on the grounds that it was considered by them sacrilegious and damaging to the image of Islam. And Khaalis' concern over the film was thought to have triggered the attack, as it was a recurring demand that occurred at several times during the hostage taking that the film should be legally banned. But it is also obvious that Khaalis and the group around him also mixed their own radicalism with personal reasons too. For example, Khaalis denounced the Jewish judge who had presided at the trial of his family's killers, repeatedly alleging that the Jews control the courts and the press. And he connected his own judicial personal issues with a greater struggle against the Jews. For the Hanafi Movement group, this was framed as a larger struggle of a bigger goal of stopping Jewish dominion of the world by attacking the Bnei Birth building. The group had chosen this target as a symbol of their grudge against the Jews. And the timing was also chosen due to this, due to the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister Rabin was at the Kennedy Center at this time as well. And Khaalis also accused the Egyptian government of seeking peace with the Jews. The group around Khaalis wanted a religious racial war against the Jews that they thought would bring about an utopian new world. They mixed racial ideas, probably inspired by the racial antisemitism in the Nation of Islam, together with views about millenarian Islamic utopias, which historically have been typical of certain strains of Hanafi Sunni Islam. And I give emphasis to racialized antisemitism here, because the focus upon the various accusations and the rhetoric that was used by this group was rather racialized, more than it was focused upon the Jews as a religious group that stood against, for example, their views of Islam. A focus upon the difference in religious practice on the religion itself has been more the standard when it comes to anti-Jewish rhetoric coming from Muslim groups, historically at least, rather than upon race. Unlike the racialized Nation of Islam influenced rhetoric of Khaalis and the rest of the Hanafi movement. But putting ideology and religious sentiments aside, it is quite clear that this attack was also deeply connected to Khaalis' personal issues and problems, as he referenced the murder of his family at several times during the hostage taking, and he wanted to bring attention to the murder of his family in 1973 by using this hostage taking. And he claimed to want justice for them by doing this hostage taking. And the hostage taking was part of bringing this matter to greater attention. The wrongdoings of the Nation of Islam towards him and others, which is exemplified in the following statement from Khaalis. Get on the phone and call President Carter and some of those senators that never sent a call. A condolence message. Do you not realize when my family was wiped out? No one said one word. Not one. Not even a preacher. Not even a minister. Not even a spiritual advisor. Not even a city council member. So, I'm very glad you're worried now. When they wiped out my family, I didn't hear about your sympathy and emotions. I got a letter the other day from my brother telling me how the brother was swaggering around in jail. The killer of Malcolm. Walking around with guards protecting him. Well, tell him it's over. Tell him it's payday. Malcolm here being Malcolm X, that was infamously murdered by members of the Nation of Islam after having left the organization. The group also demanded that the convicted for the 1973 murders of Khaalis' family be handed over to them to face true justice. This demand was rejected. And Khaalis also demanded that he would be symbolically refunded $750 in legal fees caused by a contempt of court citation issued in response to him having shouted at one of the defendants on trial for the murdering of his family members. This demand was met, and he was refunded $750. What is apparent when you read about the entire case and the series of events surrounding this dramatic hostage taking is how interwoven it is with personal tragedy on the part of Khaalis, mixed with both racial and religious radicalism. First, you have the fact of the matter that he was discharged from the US Army on grounds of mental instability. Though there are theories that he was actually discharged not due to mental instability but due to racism, and that he actually claimed as such and felt racism when he was discharged, and thus joined the Nation of Islam later. As a response to this perceived anti-black racism, he joined a group infamous for its racial black supremacy ideology, and that is actually quite far away from any type of mainstream Islam, to the degree that I wouldn't even call it a type of Islam. But that will be for another video to discuss. And within the Nation of Islam, he adopts their views about black supremacy and race ideas of black people standing in opposition to white people and to the Jews. Then he has a falling out with the Nation of Islam as he comes into contact with radical Hanafi Sufi groups. This might actually be surprising to some, as you usually associate radical Islamism and terror tactics with Wahhabism and other forms of extreme literalism, rather than esoteric, millenarian utopian views about a new religious order, a new religious millennium. But this is actually not that unusual historically, as radical millenarian Hanafi Islam and not the more typical neo-Hanbalite literalist Islam has traditionally actually been the more radical extremist version of Islam historically. And it is only in more recent decades that the case has been more that there are various types of neo-Hanbali Sunni Muslims and groups that base their interpretations of Islam upon strict literalism that are doing extreme acts of terrorism and other types of violence. But regardless of this brand of radicalism being a bit different from what has been the case later, it is clear that this radicalized him, and together with all of the problems that came later with the murder of his family, problems in court, and the fact that you also have to remember that this was the 70s in America. It was only in a decade right before the 70s, in 1965, with the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that marked the end of laws discriminating against people of color in voting. And in other fields, it was the beginning of the end for the Jim Crow laws that had constantly separated and discriminated against people of color in the United States. But even though the laws were gone, that did not mean that there wasn't still heavy racial tensions and discrimination in practice still towards people of color. And you did have people getting killed due to their various political initiatives against racism and for the rights of people of color. Martin Luther King just being one famous example of this, as he was just killed a couple of years after the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as he was assassinated in the year 1968. In addition, you had various riots erupting and racial violence being used by various groups, both by black and white supremacists. And it is in this environment of racial tensions that people such as Khaalis are getting radicalized into both racial ideologies and into religious extremism, as a response to social pressures and as a response to perceived racism around them, both real and imagined. You have to remember that Khaalis did not have a stable life. First, he was discharged from the military, and this was because of either mental illness or possible racism. Then he worked various small jobs, such as being a jazz musician. Then he went into this black supremacy group of the Nation of Islam, and then he gets his family murdered too later. And at the same time, there is this entire environment around him where racial tensions abound, and there is still a lot of lingering racial resentment and discrimination due to the previous decades of discrimination and racial hierarchy. It is not strange that you then turn to either racial supremacy groups like the Nation of Islam, or you turn to utopian religious views about a better future, about a better society. And Khaalis turned to both. Khaalis in this did not differ much from other people that have historically turned to various extremist political and religious movements when times have been tough. Desperation and frustration are the parents of radicalism. Add to this that Khaalis allegedly also had mental issues, which was why he was discharged from the military. And these mental issues could have possibly made him more prone to utilize violence and more prone to turn to various radical groups that were known for being violent. And Khaalis was far from being the only one that engaged in high-profile violent activities during this time. As you have, for example, the 1973 Brooklyn hostage crisis in January, the Zebra murders from October 1973 to April 1974, and the deadly attack on the Israeli Olympians in Munich in 1972, and several other events. Events which it was theorized that Khaalis might have been a copycat of. Indeed, in connection to the Hanafi Siege, the following was stated. Harold Vysotsky, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Northwestern University, believes that deranged persons have a passion for keeping up with the news and imitating it. These crimes are highly contagious, he says. Today in the USA, they are a virulent social illness. The Hanafi Siege was just one incident of many that had occurred before. Racial and religious radicalism and personal tragedy all mixed in a brew that created this situation. But mostly stemming more from personal tragedy and circumstance than from anything else. Though it did have a particularly religious character to it too. As the reading of the Quran to Khaalis to appeal to his conscience actually worked. Because it seems like Khaalis in some ways was convinced by this. Convinced to eventually lay down his weapons by religious arguments, pointing towards a sincerity in at least some sort of religious belief. A terrorist attack that started due to a mix of personal circumstances, racist views and religious views was ultimately ended due to religious views as well, limiting the numbers of deaths to only 2 persons, which, considering the scale of the operation, ought to not be seen as a very large amount of people that got killed. This ought not to be considered as something that minimizes the death of the 2 persons, nor does it minimize the suffering of the over 100 persons involved as hostages and bystanders caught in these events, and many of them probably scarred for life from them. Yet, considering the entire scale of the operation, with over 100 people taken hostage, and the potential of violence that existed in this group, it is still noteworthy that so few actually died. And this can be connected to the very complex relationship of religion affecting actions, as religious motives were cited as one of the reasons for the hostage-taking, but religion was also used to eventually make Khaalis surrender, demonstrating the complex nature of beliefs and faith on human action. And this was the Hanafi Siege, and I hope you, my viewers, found it interesting. If you have any questions or other comments, please do post them, as I love interacting with you, my viewers. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.